the shipbuilding contracts awarded today are aimed at adding ships to Canada's naval and coast guard fleets. But how does Canada's Navy stack up against the rest of the world? Here's a look by the numbers. Canada's Navy currently has 33 ships split between the Eastern and Western forces. Our Coast Guard has 116 ships in active service. The new contracts add 28 ships, although mostly to replace those being decommissioned. Considering Canada has the longest coastline in the world, doesn't sound like a lot. About the size of the Dutch Navy, it has 30 ships. Compare it to the Australian Navy and their 54 ships, or the British Navy. It's got 98. Of course, the countries with the biggest navies are the ones you'd expect. China's Navy has 200 ships under its command, and then there's the U.S. Navy, which has 268 ships. So the awarding today of the contracts was definitely depoliticized, but also hugely important, not just for the jobs that are created, but also to restore and refurbish the fleets of the Coast Guard and the Navy. How does it all stack up, and is it likely to succeed? Stephen Staples joins us now. He's president of the Rideau Institute. Great to have you with us.
Nice to be here.
Stephen, I want to start right with whether we need the ships, because obviously we have competing demands throughout the Army for refurbishments and replacements of equipment. Is this a good expenditure?
Well, I think that's a great question. A lot of people were focused on who won the sweepstakes today and which shipyard was going to get the big $30 billion plus contract. But the key question is this a good use of money? Do we really need this many naval ships? I mean, when you look at it, the kind of fleet that the Canadian Navy is using right now was designed during the Cold War when we were in a standoff against the Soviets. And we're essentially maintaining that same size. Now, I don't know what kind of firepower the Somali pirates are packing these days, but I'm not sure we need a fleet of new destroyers and frigates in order to deal with that kind of problem, nor do we need 8 Arctic patrol ships, which can't even break ice bigger than 1 meter thick, to float around up in the Arctic for what purpose? But I think so much of the focus has just been on who's going to get this big plum contract, when most people should be thinking, is this a good use of Canadian tax dollars given the economy and the state it is in now?
I'm assuming we do need some ships to protect our coastlines, even though much of it's in the Arctic where it's pretty hard to attack us. But at the end of the day, we do have some ports and we do have some need for some patrolling. Perhaps the best solution is a mid-term one where we don't spend as much, because actually anything over 30 is a lot of dollars when you talk billions, and right now we've got a lot of debt. We probably don't need this much. What about a compromise with certain ships budgeted now and some punted down 10 years from now?
Well, I think that it is a long-term project that they're looking on, which will take a long time to deliver on. But I think your point is well taken, and that we should hedge a little bit on this. I am, slightly encouraged by the fact that they're focusing on the Coast Guard. The Coast Guard really do need some ships. They do not have as strong a lobby as the Navy does, clearly in Ottawa. And there's a lot of science, research, some of the mapping, and search and rescue is definitely a need, including in the Arctic. But we don't need this kind of naval firepower, and that is 96% of what this money is going to be going to, is the Navy. So we could focus on some ships for the Coast Guard, certainly, but I don't think we need this kind of massive outlay for the Navy.
It's interesting that the process was so carefully depoliticized, consultants brought in to determine the right location, no politicians at the announcement. Might we have taken that even a step further or earlier and asked the consultants whether we need these at all? What's the best deployment of this capital? I mean, I'd be curious to sit down with some senior generals in the military and say, you can have, whatever it works out to be, $20 billion of expenditures. Do you want it on ships, or do you need something else more?
Yeah, I think that's a concern. How is the military's actually been having a difficult time handling the number of contracts it's been doling out over the last while. It's a massive burden to undertake these kinds of big capital acquisitions. They've been buying aircraft, they've been buying land vehicles, tanks and whatnot. The Auditor General, you remember, just a few years ago warned about the massive cost overruns that were incurred because of the mismanagement of the helicopter contracts. So while we might have a fairly impartial process, and I take them at face value today in the selection of the contract, I think we need to make sure that the government is watching very closely about how this unfolds and make sure that it stays on price and that the products are delivered, the ships are delivered as it was intended to be.
But in the history of military spending in any country, cost overruns are a standard. I mean, what do? Often the governments change hands during the period the contract's being awarded, and you get new guys managing it. That's typically what happens. That's one of the reasons that the bureaucracy underneath doesn't efficiently deal with it. What do we have as Canadian taxpayers to claw back waste? What can we do about it?
Well, here's one idea. I think we need a dedicated parliamentary committee that has the military and Industry Canada and Public Works come and report regularly on the process of military procurement, these big projects, like they do down in the United States. And there are major consequences if the costs go up above a certain point, or if they miss deadlines, that some of the programs can in fact be cancelled. So it's a real strong disciplinary force, and because Canada is spending so much on defence procurement, far too much in my view at this point, given the circumstances, but at least we should make sure, as the Auditor General has warned us, that those dollars are being spent wisely and that there's a regular reporting back to Parliament, and it's not just sort of sailing off into the bureaucracy.
This seemed to be what people expected, that the Irving Shipyard in Halifax would be the bigger recipient. Is it the right thing in your view? Did this go the way it's best to go?
Well, it's hard to say. I mean, whether it's 2 or 3 shipyards, I think that they probably went through a fairly rigorous process. They said there were a number of bids for these, so I'm hoping that they've made the right choice in all that. There probably is some economy to be had there. What they've done is they divided the combat ships, basically the ships with all the guns, go to Nova Scotia. Everything else is going to Vancouver. And Quebec will probably get some maintenance contracts, and they were careful to point that out, that there's $500 million a year for ongoing maintenance of these ships. So they'll continue to spread this around over time.
All right. Stephen, great to have you with us today.
Thanks much.
Stephen Staples, president of the Rideau Institute. Coming up next.